Peace and love, everyone. Welcome. My name is Andrew Hewson. I'm a spiritual teacher. I'm here with my friend Davidya Buckland. David and I have been having conversations for over a year now on different subjects surrounding the unfoldment of enlightenment, what he refers to as stages of enlightenment, and what I refer to as contextual modalities. David is an author. He has a book, Our Natural Potential. He has, I think, another book on the way, if not two, and then two. Okay. Then he also has a blog, davidya.ca, where he writes about similar themes that we explore here together. So I'm back with David, and we're going to be talking today about devotion. So thank you for being here with me, David.
Well, thank you, Andrew.
Would you like to start us up?
Okay. I think one of the first things it's important to talk about is to define what we mean by devotion.
Yes.
For a lot of people, when we use the word devotion, they think in terms of faith and belief, more prominently belief, and perhaps blind faith, and sort of the religious connotations from modern thinking. Whereas devotion is really about the heart, and it can't really be expressed until the heart is open, and that's something that tends to happen after the initial awakening. So it's an interesting thing. So we kind of, without that initial awakening, the full expression of the heart isn't really there yet, and so this isn't to say that we can't be devoted before awakening. Some people are inclined in that direction. They have a natural inclination to devotion, but the belief is a function of the mind, and this isn't what we're talking about. Isn't about the mind. It's about the heart, and it's about those higher feeling values. And it's essentially what we're pointing to is about surrender, letting go, allowing, being okay with what is. That's more on the level of the devotion that I believe we speak to. Whereas, sometimes they talk in terms of like prayer, for example. They'll talk about petitionary prayer, where you're basically asking for something. Mm-hmm. And that's more coming on the level of belief and the mind. And then there's more, thy will be done, the prayer of surrender, of allowing. Mm-hmm. And so it's really, it's about coming down into the heart, or up into the heart, really, rather than trying to create a relationship with the divine through the mind. The mind kind of catches up with that afterwards, and then it can give it language and so on like that, but it's not really the vehicle for it. Do you have anything to add to that, or?
Sure. Yeah, I could say several things surrounding those points that are just kind of different perspectives on that. Uh-huh. And of course, we are very much in alignment with the recognition that devotion has nothing to do with belief. It doesn't have anything to do with just hearing about some God out there and feeling like that is something nice and then deciding that we're going to be a certain way. Devotion isn't really a decision in the way that I speak about it. It's not something that we do. Yeah.
Yes.
It's something that is born through us, you might say. It's something that is oftentimes likened unto a seed that is lying dormant in the heart and is activated through grace. And once this seed is activated, it begins to sprout and it grows, and it's often spoken about as a creeper, something that sort of creeps and covers and really begins to just express itself as a way of life being with itself, as a way of the self being with itself and being with its own divinity. So when Maharishi, came to the West, or the message of TM came to the West, and of course, just during that time period, there was also several other traditions, some of which were Bhakti traditions, that were also becoming popularized in the West. One of them was a lineage, Vaishnava lineage, Gaudiya Vaishnavism in particular, and often known as Hare Krishnas as well. So there tends to be kind of a sectarian understanding of devotion in certain circles where, devotion is this and it belongs to us. And that can take place in various religious contexts. Yeah.
Yeah.
So in that there can be a self-limitation and an assumption where, the identified ego structure kind of takes the concept of devotion and adds it to its sense of me, and to
Yeah.
its story and to its narrative. And so what I feel like Maharishi was saying is that basically that's not it, and you really need to know yourself. You need to realize yourself before you can know the fullness of what devotion is. But I would also say that was in a certain time period, and it was in reference to a certain group of experiencing, and that now we're in a different period. Yeah. And devotion is something that, as you mentioned as well, many of us do have an inclination towards, and that inclination can begin to express itself prior to the initial shift. And I've seen this not only in my own experience, but I'm witnessing it every day, generally, around the teaching, which this is more of a devotional teaching, or it is a devotional teaching.
Yes.
That's coming through here. So in that, there's an understanding that the heart can open, and that this seed of devotion can sprout even when there hasn't been the awakening, even when there hasn't been the realization of our reality. But it doesn't have anything to do with doing it. It doesn't have anything to do with believing it. It's something that can't be helped. It can't be stopped. Yeah. And
I'd make an observation here. Most people, because of the nature of the way our culture in the West is around emotions, we tend to develop quite a thick crust around the heart. It's very defended, energetic crust. And so in order for devotion to express itself, we have to kind of break that heart open, crust, break that crust out and open the heart. Yeah, in the way to describe it energetically in the process is there's the Kundalini awakening process, and the Kundalini comes up to the heart, and there's an initial awakening of the heart on that level, and then there's the Kundalini continues up and until you have the crown and awakening, and the central idea is that Shakti is awakened, rises to join Shiva in consciousness in the crown. They come together, and then they descend together. And so when in the descent, when the two together come down to the heart, there's kind of like a higher octave value of the heart chakra, pradaya, that opens up, and that allows a much more universal, a much fuller value of love than sort of a personal love level that you might experience prior to that. So that's the sense of the mechanics or whatever behind the idea that post awakening there's that possibility to support. The idea being that once you have that stable inner platform, then you have a safe and comfortable platform for the heart to open from. But certainly there's lots of variations. Some people are able to settle into a much deeper value of surrender even prior to awakening, and have that beautiful flowering of devotion earlier than some others of us.
Yeah, it does. It's physiology specific, and it also relates to what we've spoken about in prior conversations surrounding like pre-existent development, in sattva and atman. So when we have that understanding, we're also able to recognize that devotion can be supportive of the initial shift, and it's not contingent upon that. And I think it's a very important understanding to have, because otherwise it kind of places those that haven't had the initial shift outside of the realm of the possibility for true devotion. And
Yes.
that's just not, that's not my experience, but I do understand the intelligence of what you're describing. And I also feel like it's important to acknowledge that even in religious settings, there are many, sincere devotees. There are many sincere aspirants, and they really are tasting some degree of love for the divine, whether it's through what seems to be a personal relationship with Jesus Christ, or through what seems to be devotion to the Buddha's teaching, or a particular teacher, or devotion to Krishna, devotion to the Divine Mother. Although there are, this is also fraught with all kinds of ritualistic sort of going through the motions and shoulds and shouldn'ts, and kind of
And
more
confusing
just,
the symbols with the actual,
yes, exactly, not recognizing that the form is just there to reflect something more fundamental, and it still seems to be within the realm of separation. There's no doubt about that. But even within that context, I have seen very, very sincere cases of the flowering of love. And what that really represents is, from a broader context in the soul's apparent evolution, or the evolution of the conscious experiencing within the self, is that there is some trajectory in place, there is some flow, some movement, and these things that you're talking about surrounding the various limitations of interpretation are going to have to be worked out. They're going to be run up against, and may appear to stall the full flowering of the process. But there is no doubt the possibility for devotion, even in egoic dominance. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's also useful to understand in this process that it's essentially part of everybody's path, and it'll vary in degree. There are, in India they talk in terms of people who are on a jnani or path of the intellect process, more through a process of understanding is their natural mode. There are people who are more karma yogis that are in the field of action and doing, and in that sense, it's a doing out of service. But again, we're talking about a process of surrender. So we learn by, being out there in the world and doing stuff, and then we let go of the personal control through that process. And or with the jnani, more about the analysis and seeing through, and the mind level. And then there's the bhakti, the devotional path. But we all have some of each. And there's kind of I used to kind of have this idea that, you were on this path or you were on this path, and there was no crossing between them. But I realized that no, it's actually, they're all in there. It's just we tend to have a personal emphasis, but there's always a mixture. And also at certain points in the journey, they'll become amplified. Mm-hmm. For example, I mentioned, the descent after awakening, and there's that stage that Maharishi calls the God consciousness stage, where the higher heart that I described opens up, and so there's a natural devotional period in there. Mm. And where that devotion is directed also varies. Some will become devoted. The classic thing is to become devoted to God, and it'll be some form of God, like, for example, maybe Jesus or Mary Magdalene or Shiva or Divine Mother or Vishnu or just about anything, essentially. Whatever form that we can relate to. And again, in this case, the form is not the idol worship. It's a representation to us that we can relate to as a vehicle for flowing devotion. Yes. In order for devotion to flow, there has to be an object to flow through. we don't have to experience that object as separate from us, but it still needs to be an object. There still needs to be something to flow to. And so it's kind of like a vehicle of devotion. And in that sense, it's quite valid. And that's the point of these rituals and so on like that you mentioned. But when if they become divorced from that, then they're just rituals. They're just kind of song and dance, so to speak. They're not really taking you into it. And so there's kind of like this combination of things. There's these aspects of our journey and our own emphasis, and then there's the periods of time. With the way Maharishi used to frame it, is that the initial, most of us are more karma yogis. For the initial shift, we're kind of touching in through our practices, we're touching into source and then integrating that through activity, through action, and learning to be in the world in a way that supports that inner growth. And then in the God consciousness phase, it's more of a devotional process. But and then with the unity phase, it's more the intellect, that now distinction of where the intellect shifts from looking out and dividing to looking in and recognizing the oneness, and so it comes a process of joining. That is the self, and that is also the self, and that is also the self, and that is also divine, and that is also divine. Now, the one variation in there's a lot of people in the West who are shifting from cosmic consciousness or self-realization into unity fairly directly, because there's less of that support, less of the heart has been healed, and so there is less of a devotional phase at that point. So then it tends to come later at some point. And it may, there's variations there too. Some people have a more like a devotion to a form, and that kind of sense is what is described as the personal process. We have a personal relationship with the divine as a way of flowing that love, and that's prominent in that kind of the God consciousness phase more. But there are those who are, particularly if they're a stronger jnani or on the intellect path, they may have a more impersonal relationship with the divine. Yeah. So there's still a flow of love, but the divine is more that impersonal being, or the value of Shiva as infinite consciousness.
Yeah.
Although it's not a devotion to consciousness per se, it's devotion to certain qualities. And ultimately, it's all divine. And so it's just whatever qualities of the divine that we most relate to, we can most easily surrender to, essentially. That devotion flows. Anyways, I've been speaking for a while.
No, that's great. Yeah. So there's, a teaching or an expression is always context specific. And it's really beautiful to witness how in our current time, there's a movement for a greater degree of revealment. We're moving out of a darker age, a darker period where there was more concealment. Things were more clouded and crusted over by all of this unresolved material. So when we're talking about devotion, we're always going to be talking about resolution. We're always going to be talking about healing. We're always going to be talking about the conversion of that material, which was clouding, which was covering, which was, filtering the experience in such a way that it really disabled the fluidity and the fullness of devotion to make itself known. So what I'm witnessing now, as I speak about, cases of sincere devotion beginning pre-initial shift, and that being accompanied by feminine aspect field recognition and recognition of the self through the appearances of form and motion, even pre-initial shift. This is something that's relatively new in terms of our our current sort of history and what we've spoken about. Yes. And this is relating to the collective enlivenment of the field. So yes. As there is more purification, as there's more surfacing and resolution, then the truth of what devotion is becomes more of a possibility for more points of experiencing in a broader way, and in a much more smoother way. But it does correlate with and depend upon this willingness to heal.
Yes.
So it's a very important aspect of devotion.
Yeah, the feminine side, the sattva side of the equation is so important. Yeah, one thing might be useful to touch on here too is this tends to be a process for most people. There has to be some value of trust in the process and in the nature of life in order for that kind of surrender needed to get into the deeper stuff. I mean, certainly there's lots of superficial, unresolved experiences and emotions and stuff like that that can come up and be processed in a matter of course through our spiritual practices and daily life. But some of the deeper resistance, that takes a deeper level of trust and surrender. And so there tends to be this process of when we hear teachings, for example, to recontextualize our life so that we understand events of life differently. Like instead of seeing the world as some random chaos that victimizes us on a regular basis, we start to see the order and intent, and we start to recognize the simple laws like karma. There's an action and there's a reaction and there's a consequence. And sometimes they're separated, but sometimes they come a little closer together and it's more obvious. We can see the connection between I did something stupid and then that was the consequence. And so there's a bit of a learning of the process and understanding of how to be in life, and then a growing trust, and that gives us a platform for surrender and for opening the heart, and then we begin to see the hand of God, so to speak. We begin to see the way the divine works in the world. And particularly if refined perception is unfolding, we start to see some of the mechanics of the world around us, and we see some of these things, more directly. Yeah. And so this gradual process of going deeper and deeper and, going beyond sort of synchronicities and coincidences into a much deeper understanding of what's taking place around us. And there's this idea of nature support as well, where we start to, when we act more and more in sync with the world around us, then our actions and desires and actions are supported, and we get results much more quickly and easily. We're not struggling with life all the time. And when the struggle comes up, it's usually a flag that there's some karma coming up and there's something to be seen and so on. And we just learn to be with life much more smoothly. And then as that deepens even further and we purify and heal more, then even deeper values are open up, and we start to go into those more subtle levels. And that may be seen, or it may be felt, or it may be heard. There's various ways we might relate to that refinement of perception. But we tend to settle into deeper and deeper values, and we start to be able to touch into, clear intuition, and flavors of bliss can come up, the bubbling bliss, and soma. We've talked about that, which greatly enhances the refinement process. And at a certain point, we come to begin to experience qualities of the divine more directly. And that, of course, greatly increases the trust and the faith in the process. And then faith has a value here. We're not putting our faith in some concept. We're putting our faith in our direct experience.
Yes.
And there's various ways we can talk about that, but essentially there's that process of refinement and the awakening heart, and then we can develop a relationship with the divine in some way, impersonal or personal, depending on our style and orientation. And figuring out what that is in advance, like you can get a Jyotish or Vedic astrology reading, and it'll tell you who your personal God is supposed to be, but whether that's actually valid or not is, in practice, this is something that's going to happen when it happens, and it's just going to show up, and you're going to just have an affinity. It's like when you meet someone knew that you just have an immediate affinity with. It's kind of like that, but on a higher level. And it's, Maharishi used to talk about it as the highest ideal, our highest conception. Because really, divinity is so vast and so complete and so total that it's not, we don't have the physiology really to take that in. And so if we're going to relate to the divine, we kind of take a piece, not a piece, a quality of divinity that, and a form of divinity that we most relate to, and then we can create a relationship. But it's not also it tends to be a single form, but we can also have relationships with other forms or other qualities of divinity as well. Certainly, we're not limited to that. But there's going to be a particular style that we most relate to.
Yes.
And then deeper along, there's the deeper process of surrendering, of merging with the divine in form, the expressed qualities of the divine, and transcending that into Brahman, and then discovering pure divinity beyond that. And so there's a return, like there can be, it depends on the process, but there can be a break from our relationship with divinity, and then coming back into it again from a higher level. So there's a whole series of stages, and how that's going to unfold for you individually is going to vary widely. But there's just, the point essentially is that there's this process of unfolding where we're going to come to the divine in a step-by-step way, and it'll be punctuated by certain key things like the first experience and so on. And on the level of experience too, there's just that cautionary note. We're more likely to first run into, as perception refines, we're more likely to first run into astral sorts of beings. And these can be a number of different kinds of things, humans between lives and so on like that. And it's just, basically the rules are very similar to the rules you would run into meeting someone on the street, about talking to strangers and not automatically trusting just because they look fancy or they seem important or something, that we don't automatically give them all our trust. This is where feeling value is really important. It's not about appearances and so on, but the feeling value. And so sometimes people come to the divine, more typically people will come to the divine after they first begun experiencing other kinds of beings first. And the challenge there, of course, is the other kinds of beings. The divine has, like angels and so forth, actual light beings. Know they have a relationship with the divine, and they have their purpose is clear for them, and so they don't mess around with our life that way. They're only there to be supportive. But less subtle beings, broadly astral sorts of things, beings that reside in the mind and the emotional kind of levels, energy and mental levels. Those kind of beings are mixed. There's certainly beings of value in there, but there's also going to be beings that basically have disengaged from their evolutionary process and got bored and they're trying to manipulate and play games, just like you find with people sometimes. There's those ones. So you just have to be a little careful. There are challenges in that process. So you want to be able to move past that part and get into the deeper stuff so that you can culture trust and experience-based faith rather than getting entangled in the messy stuff and not be culturing trust and getting to a place where you can be devoted. You really don't want to get into a codependent relationship with some random subtle being. I've seen it.
Yeah, I know. It's not uncommon.
Yeah, and those kind of things too. One of the things to understand there is that they live on energy, the way we live on food. They live on the energy of that level, and they'll tend to favor, just like we might have a sweet tooth, or we might have a we really enjoy savory. They'll be the same kind of way, and they'll favor a certain kind of energy, and so they may try to manipulate us into into culturing fear or anger or something like that, as you know, or whatever, because they like that energy. But that's really not very evolutionary for us. So yeah. Anyways, not to get into any big horror story. Just you want to move past that stuff.
No, that's
that,
all very, very important. And
yeah, and that's why it's so important that we're stepping outside of our normal day-to-day experience through our spiritual practices, through transcendence, samadhi, turiya. There's various names for it, but transcending our the emotions and mind and touching into source. So we're culturing those deeper values and going beyond that, and then we begin to get a sense. And then if we're doing the healing and stuff like that, then our emotional arena will clean out, and then we'll be emotionally aware, and the feeling value of the beings that we're in contact with will give them away. Basically, if there's something a little bit off with even though they look fancy, if there's something a little off with them, we use the feeling value, then we know that this isn't a being to give our attention to. And yeah, I got into that a little bit myself early on when the stuff first started unfolding. So yeah, with that stuff, it's just best to wait until it goes a little deeper, and then the heart will be more healed, the perception will be more refined, the emotions will be more alert, fine feelings be more present, and so yeah, the whole thing works a whole lot better when the ground is more prepared for those arenas. And again, this is what I mentioned earlier about there's a lot of people who are skipping the God consciousness phase after awakening simply because that isn't there yet. And it's also worth noting again in here that that value of sattva or clarity and the value of atman or consciousness are cumulative through past lives, from prior lives. So when we're born in this life, we pick up where we left off, essentially. Now, I've observed that there appears to be this process where when we come into the life that there's some ancestral stuff or our own karma to work through before that kicks in. And so it's quite common for people to discover spirituality, for example, in their late teens or well, even later in their life, and or take it more seriously later in their life. And that's just the process, that there's some things to work through first. Or my own process, I can note that there was a period of time where it came online, became very into it, and then life drew me away from it for a while, and I needed to focus on the day-to-day life for a while, and then spirituality came back into prominence again later when it was time. So we go through those kind of cycles. There's no one right way or one path through this process. It's just we can work through it.
Beautiful. Yeah, on that note about incarnations, there's also certain incarnations that are here solely out of service. So it's sort of a call and response kind of a situation. And they have, because they were not bound to the samsaric cycle, they've taken on, in order to take a body, a certain portion of collective residue or collective karma. And so that tends to show up in a pretty contrasting way, during the incarnation. And there's variation there, of course. But that's also another possibility, because there's multiple soul groups and there are, different options and different things unfolding on Earth. And I just want to go back to the concept of faith just for a minute, because I think it's important. There's an understanding in the Buddhist traditions called the awakening of faith, and I find it to be a very helpful understanding and something that can enable us to kind of step into what the essence of faith is, outside of its more limited, concealed representations. And when they speak about the awakening of faith, they're talking about this awakening of trust and intuitive inner knowing, and faith based on that knowing in the path, in what's being presented, whether that's the Four Noble Truths and the Eightfold Path, or it can take place in different traditions. And in the Buddhist context, it is referential to various entry points within the Buddhist systems. But they see that as being essential for really expressing in a certain way on the path. So if we have, let's say someone's introduced to meditation, we can be presented with these, evidence of its usefulness and so on and so forth. But we really still have to have some degree of faith that it is worth it in order to step into the meditation process, particularly to, meditate twice a day and, not just for 1 month and those kinds of things. And so I was introduced to this understanding, which I find also very helpful, that faith is already a part of the human experience. When we get in our car, we go out to drive, we have the faith that, the car is going to get us to where we're going. We have the faith that we're not going to get, sideswiped at an intersection. And much of our experience is lived on faith, but it's lived on faith that's put into things that really aren't as trustworthy as they seem to be.
Yes.
So we tend to trust the fragile instability of form and the appearances of objectified subjectivity.
And our stories about ourselves and about the people around us. We kind of have these narratives.
Exactly. Yeah. So we have faith in these superficial values of experience.
Yes.
And many wouldn't call it faith. Some would call it, science or, reality, understanding what's really going on, or whatever the case may be, proven statistics, all these different notions. But it is really a sort of faith. So in the context of traditions, what we see put forward is the possibility for a faith which kind of tends to seem contradictory to the normal daily faith of the human experience. Yeah.
Yes.
And there are more concealed versions of that. Of course, that can just become a part of the more concealed faith and just get, then it just adds to the narrative, adds to the story. There's, reckless expressions of that are based in unresolved material, and immaturity in the conscious experiencing. But there's also authentic expressions of faith. There's also an authentic alignment with a certain understanding, which is intuitively known to be of the nature of truth in the heart. And that's how we're sitting here talking right now, is because that faith at some point was awakened. We were able to take a step into that which we resonated with as being aligned with truth, as being aligned with the possibility of enlightenment, And so we don't want to, throw the baby out with the bathwater and discard it entirely. But it is important to recognize, and this is what I feel like you were saying, is that there are so many layers of concealed faith, concealed devotion, that the truth of what that word is pointing to seems to have been lost, in these falsified ideas and these limited interpretations of it.
Yes.
But here we're living in an age where we're called to kind of realize the truth of what faith is, the truth of what devotion is. Yeah. And that's moving to be born through us, and it is taking place.
Yes.
But this is always going to correlate with resolution. It's always going to correlate with healing. So this kind of goes back to your point about practices. And in this teaching, I suggest something that I call the 4 pillars. And basically, it's where there's an introspective lifestyle that's being lived that includes the attentive allowing of unresolved energy, unresolved, emotional reflections that are going to begin to surface through the basic intention of the willingness to heal, of the willingness to realize the truth. And so when we're living in this way, and we do have these methodologies that support honest evaluation of experience and attentive allowing of unresolved material, then we begin to see the crusts and the calcifications that have developed around faith and devotion, and the clarity of this light that is experiencing itself, begin
Yeah.
to break away and begin to actually even be converted into that which serves the enlivenment of the truth of what devotion actually is.
Yeah, it's funny. I think back on a lot of these words. I had quite a negative view on, even to use the word God, kind of joked on the word, because the associations I had with, and my family went to church when I was young, and Sunday school and all that. And so I was kind of taught in this kind of style of understanding, not as guilt-ridden as some Catholic scenarios, but I went through a rejection of that because there were so many issues with it, and quite obviously, when I stopped to actually look at it, and so there was rejection of all the ideas that are that were around that, like faith and devotion and so on, and so it's an interesting experience to come around to it again, because the resistance that had developed around those ideas also had to be shed too.
Yes.
And I tend to use the word divine now more than God, to some degree, partly because there's slightly less resistance to that word for other people. But yeah, they're still button words for a lot of people, and I can fully understand but yet when you come to the actuality of it, when you're able to shed that resistance and come to the actuality of it, it's there's nothing in the world of form that can come close.
Yes.
To the divine. It's just because it's so much more than, if you think about it just from our perspective of our creation, our creation contains many, many, many universes. And if you think of, we have one universe that's full of life, on not just physical life, but on all these various subtle levels. And then there's many universes, and then our creation is only one of many creations. Yeah. And the scale of the divine is just, mind-boggling, beyond conception. And yet the divine is everywhere. But one of the most direct ways to access divinity is through the heart.
Yes.
I remember many years ago, I became aware that there's this kind of thread that comes down through, it connects up through this whole process of creation down into the universe, and comes down into the top of the head and down through the chakras. And sort of the standard understanding. But then later on, I became aware there was also another thread that came directly into the heart, kind of like at a T. And that thread connected directly to the divine. Didn't go through all the other stuff, all those layers up above, all the way back to the source. And so it kind of, and that's where what would the West we would call the soul resides while we're alive in this body. It's kind of it runs from the heart. And it's such a central part of the process. And there's a lot of emphasis in spiritual circles on consciousness. And but that's just like, that's the platform for experience to be had and for knowing to unfold. But even consciousness itself is just an expression of the divine. The divine is so much more. And so it's this kind of emotional healing, and so it's so valuable for quality of life. You shift from mild depression and the moodiness of the day and all this kind of stuff going on, into kind of like those things still go on, but they're kind of like ripples on the top of the ocean, and you sit in this ocean of peace and love and happiness and satisfaction, and sort of those things become far more prominent and consistent is the right word, but they're essentially qualities of consciousness itself. And so and they're, which are in turn qualities of divinity. And so they're just there all the time. Whereas, anger is just like a reaction to some surface thing. You see someone do something inappropriate and it's natural to feel anger. But if you've healed in that, where you experience a wave of anger and then it completes and passes. Whereas if there's like, oh, anger's bad, I shouldn't be feeling anger, I'm above that, or whatever, some resistance, then it kind of comes up and then it gets caught up in the shoulds and musts and the resistance and the grasping and all this kind of dynamics of suffering, essentially. And what ends up happening is it doesn't complete, and then it sits there.
Yeah.
We have this kind of shadow of anger that's sitting there with all this other stuff we've got, and it just adds another layer to muddy the waters.
Yeah.
And culture suffering. And so on the flip side of that, it's interesting. And I'm working on a translation of the Yoga Sutra right now. And I finished the translation. I'm working on the commentary and so on. And it talks in there, and it's interesting. It comments that even if you don't, most people don't realize they're suffering. Essentially, their experience they consider normal to have all these cruddy emotions that don't seem to complete and hang around and that kind of stuff, and that's considered normal. But from the perspective of yoga, that's suffering, because our natural potential is to not live that way, is to be free of our afflictions and the weight of all this emotional baggage and so on. It takes time, but if we adopt some good techniques for healing, for transcending, so on, then over time we heal that backlog, and we become clearer and more peaceful and more settled and more joyous, and just this gradual opening up and progressive quality of life improvements, until we can come to a place where and it's funny, there's the old saying, Joseph Campbell used to say, follow the bliss. And if you want to know what the right thing to do is, where's the happiness? Follow the bliss. And similarly, the term life is bliss. Mm-hmm. But it's interesting, that's an actual literal thing.
Yes.
Because it's that the vibration of life, of creation becoming, is bliss experienced on that level. If we're able to experience that on that level, then it's happiness. It's just right there. And it's there all the time, because everything around us is being recreated in every moment.
Yes.
And that process is bliss.
Yes.
And it's, it's our birthright.
Yes. Beautiful. Yeah, there's just one thing about that that statement, follow the bliss. Sometimes it can be used, or a similar understanding can be used to avoid facing what seems to be the difficult, more challenging layers of residue. So,
or we can chase pleasure rather than bliss.
Exactly.
I like ice cream. I'll just eat ice cream because that's follow the bliss. But that's actually not quite bliss.
That's not. Well, it is technically, but not.
Well, it's yeah. But then, and again, that gets into clearing out your emotional baggage, so you actually experience what bliss is.
Yes, exactly. So the teaching that comes through here is a transmutative path, which basically recognizes that the primary distinction between the masculine and feminine aspects of the self, which is the changeless, silent, pure awareness, and the full, vibrant, conscious aliveness, is an infinite pulsation. It's a timeless pulsation, and that pulsation, through its own self-experiencing flow, appears to conceal itself in an illusion of separation. And in that concealment, there appears to be a resistance to the flow of experiencing through the illusion of control. And in that resistance, there's a layering of residue. There's a layering of unresolved condensation, which is essentially the pulsation of bliss. But it's been layered in the illusion of separation, in the illusion of fragmentation. And so that condensation moves to come up into the surface, into the field of attention, so that it can be converted or transmuted back into the vibrant fullness of this field of life that is ourself. And the way that this relates to devotion is that it clears away that which appears to be obscuring the potential for the flow of devotion, but it's also devotion which enables the conscious experiencing to surrender in and to release the resistance around those layers of residue that are considered to be challenging, that are considered to be difficult, that have been condemned and pushed away and made wrong. What we see taking place in the non-duality kind of marketplace on one side of things is that there's essentially a rejection of God through non-duality, which shows up as kind of the no me non-duality or the no self non-duality. And this is directly related to unresolved condensation that's surrounding guilt and stickiness that is tied into the concept of God and the sense of separation from God and religious authoritarianism and things that have been misused and abused. And so there's this, in a certain sense, attempt to get out of that taking place within the conscious experiencing through non-duality. But oftentimes this doesn't include recognizing the residue and allowing for the residue to be healed and transmuted. So then,
yeah, it's interesting just to mention that in there, non-duality essentially comes out of the Advaita teaching of Adi Shankara, and it's quite interesting when you actually look at his life. He was a young sage and produced commentaries and so forth very rapidly, and had famous debates and so on. And he founded at the time he was around, the householder path had become dominant, and he reestablished a renunciate path and set up the 4 seats of the Shankaracharyas, the 4 seats of learning in India. But now we've come to the opposite extreme, where we've kind of, well, not now, but what came to pass was that we came to overemphasize the renunciate, and the householder path that most of us are on was seen as inferior. And so that's kind of in there a lot with the modern non-dualists, but the that sort of emphasis on the dry, no me, emotions, or all, desires, all that stuff is kind of, there's a tendency to reject all that, and to lean towards a renunciate style of, but some of that is just spiritual bypassing, essentially using spiritual concepts and techniques to avoid your life.
yes.
Lots of examples of that. I've fallen into it a little bit myself here and there. It's very easy, very seductive to just avoid, and you don't have to deal with it. But there's a famous story told about him when he's walking along the side of a river, and his foot gets stuck, and he can't pull it out, and he sees this woman walking over a bridge nearby, and he calls out to her to help, and she replies, "Oh, it's an illusion," essentially, and then he realizes it's Divine Mother in form, and he ends up writing this beautiful devotional poem, and his later teaching becomes much more devotional. So it's like the modern non-dualists have been emphasizing the earlier kind of more analytical, drier kind of approach that was there earlier, although I don't think it was really that. It's just kind of they've overemphasized that. But his later devotional stuff is ignored. And that's you know, that's where the richness is, you know,
Yes.
the fullness is.
Yes. So that's a part of the collective clearing that's moving to take place. And
Yeah.
so it's just a temporary phase, I would say, at least in its degree of popularity. And we're speaking in generalities, there's different levels of authenticity and
Yeah.
revealment. You know, there's like the neo non-duality, and then there's more classical and
Yeah.
those kinds of things. And then
it
we
is a
also
stepping stone too, because it has gotten a lot of people onto a path. It
Sure.
is yeah, in that sense.
Yes, everything has the potential to be utilized by grace, you know, and the call of divinity back to itself. And there's also another movement that, you know, kind of emphasizes looking at trauma and making sure that humanity, you know, is included, and not getting lost in the sort of negation uh, of the world, and really oftentimes is sort of what appears to be a correction of what is deemed to be the mistake of the modern non-duality interpretation. But I find that even in this field there's a lot of limitation, because the feminine is being associated with things that it really doesn't have anything to do with, and it is becoming about, you know, certain ways of expressing or speaking or being, and the limited identification just gets a hold of concepts and uses it, you know, to add to whatever, to being spiritual and those kinds of things. And so these are just kind of two extremes that are present, you know, in the spiritual marketplace at large. But what we're really looking at is, you know, field realization in both aspects, and then the marriage, the union of both of these aspects into a single unity, into a single
Yes.
field of flowing fullness, and then opening into source recognition.
And it's all about the mind in there, because
Yeah.
it's like when the mind is in there, it's looking for concepts, and it's listening to the two of us talk about devotion, and it's making a concept about what devotion is.
Yes.
But it's really all about the heart. And as
Yes.
you said earlier on, it's a non-doing. It's a
Yes.
surrender. It's an
Yes.
allowing.
Yes.
It's not something we do. It's something we allow. We let go of the personal control. And the mind is so entangled with personal control.
Yeah.
So it's really this, this process of, you know, this is about the heart, not the concepts. The concepts are not going to, well, they might give you a framework, but, you know, that's all it is. It's like a map. It's not the road, and confusing the map with the road is going to cause you trouble.
Exactly. And it's an expression of grace, and it's not something that we gain or earn or are better or worse at. You know, devotion is a flow of grace, a flow of divinity back within its own field of light that loops back into itself. As you were describing that little string, it's a drawing of divinity back into the truth of itself.
Yes.
And
I can give examples. You know, here, for example, I write articles and post them to my blog as an act of service.
yes,
Because I know when I was, you know, early in my path, that kind of support wasn't available, and so I make it available as best I can, and that's as a devotional service. I have a devotion to knowledge, understanding, and so I explore that a lot, and that's kind of how it expresses. And then there's also the more pure, isn't the right word, but the heart expression of devotion.
yes,
And that's been growing in all kinds of different ways.
yes,
And yeah, so it's an interesting process. I mean, you're more, I mean, overtly isn't the right word, but you have a more overt devotional process in that you're teaching a devotional approach. Whereas my practice is less overtly devotional,
Yes.
but yet even that's evolved. Like these days, I'm practicing a technique that is essentially invoking qualities of divinity. That's taught only for people who are awake, because they're able to actually practice the technique, because it requires being able to settle at a very subtle level. So it's kind of a mechanical, not mechanical is the wrong word maybe, but it's there, and it's kind of growing in different kinds of ways.
Enlivening.
That technique is also practiced in a group, so to amplify when the awake come together, and we amplify that. So it just it takes many forms. Is kind of my point.
Yes, exactly. And I think commitment is an important word also for us to mention as an expression of devotion. And you just beautifully pointed to it in reference to your commitment or your devotion to knowledge. And one of the ways that I often frame it is the devotion to truth. Yeah. And the devotion to integrity, the devotion to reality, and the willingness to give to reality, to give everything to that which is real, that which is true. And that's such a powerful potency. I mean, it's irresistible for divinity. Divinity just can't resist itself flowing towards itself like that.
Yes.
Giving itself to itself.
It's funny when the initial shift is a moment of surrender, fraction of a second, just this moment of letting go, and then the self can see itself, and the ego is surrendered, at least to some value. There's usually a bit of a back and forth with it. It tends to want to try and reassert itself, and there's habits and that support that, and so on. But I remember not long after that, my teacher commented on perpetual surrender, and I was kind of horrified, because the idea that I managed to surrender for a fraction of a second, and here and there there'll be other ones, but the idea of being in surrender all the time, I mean, that was so far from what my experience was. So so it horrified me at the time that how was I ever going to get to there? But it's just the process. It just happens as things deepen and the trust fills out, and
through surrender, that's how you get there.
Then it's sort of like, it's like, now it's sort of like, oh, life wants me to do this, so that's interesting. Sure. And okay. And I have a friend, sometimes we'll go for a drive or something, and they'll be like, oh, we're driving this way now. And just the signal comes, oh, now we're going to go over here, and something needs to be seen, or whatever, just some little thing, somebody to run into, or it's hard to say where the attention is just needed someplace a little bit.
Yeah, exactly.
So you just kind of go with the flow of life, and I make a plan and that, but it's just like, it's just an outline, some main points, and allow it to unfold the way it does.
Beautiful.
Yeah,
there's something I was going to say. I can't remember. I did want to just talk a little bit. Okay, I know. Now I remember. About devotion in reference to the teacher. There's a friend of mine who likes to say, devotion can't be taught, but it can be caught. Yeah. So when you mentioned, teaching devotion, it's more a matter of infection through reflection.
Yes.
And
well, it's like so often with awakening, it's like it's an awake person that ends up catalyzing the shift. They don't cause the shift, but because there's an awakeness there, the self can recognize itself more clearly. So quite often people will wake up from as a person's a catalyst, and the same with the heart.
Yes.
if we don't have any experience of what it is to have an open heart, there's no reference point. But then we experience somebody who has that, it can be quite a revelation.
Yes, exactly. And it's always the intelligence and the power of divinity, that's using the form, the nervous system to reflect within its own light, that potentiality that's always present within the field, so that it actualizes, so that it recognizes itself. And in this teaching that comes through here, that it runs parallel with the speaking directly to the self, as itself,
Yes.
but also that enlivenment of that flow of love that is present. And one thing that I've noticed is that there can be this tendency to have a lot of misconception about authentic devotion when it comes to the teacher-student relationship. Because there have been cases of misuse and abuse over the years, particularly, let's say in the past 40 years, many in the West have come into the light of, not being authentically aligned in a teacher-student relationship. Many teachers coming from the West, from the East into the West, and there being, various levels of unresolved material that were coloring and filtering the expression and the experiencing. Oftentimes, they really hadn't tasted a full unfoldment. I would say most of the time there was.
There can be an authentic awakening, and some value is there.
Sure.
It's just that the process isn't complete. Well,
Yes.
I don't know if anybody's complete.
But yes, I know what you're saying. Is there's not this understanding of resolution. Yeah, it's not based on this kind of continuation, and so there can be a self-limitation that crystallizes.
And then you put in a position of power over in some way, and it brings up unresolved material around identity and control and codependency and all this other messy stuff.
Yes.
And
this also correlates with the students' unresolved material.
Yeah.
They are, they have their own projections and they have their own residue, their own quote unquote. It's all kind of collective experiencing, but you know what I mean, on a point value. And then that factors into, so that meets up, it meets up in that relationship. And then that's where there seems to be some stickiness. And what I've seen is that there can be this understanding that we need to kind of just get rid of that in the West, as if that's even possible.
The whole teaching model, you mean?
Yeah, as if that's even possible, because actually the authenticity of a teacher-student relationship, which is based in sincere reflection of divinity within its own light and is founded in true devotion, has a subtle structure and has its own laws of nature. So we're not going to get rid of it and just throw it away. And that by no means is a solution to the expression of unresolved residue that we've seen unfold. So as a collective, and in the West in particular, we have a responsibility, to recognize where the issue is, and to address the issue. And I don't feel that it's in service to set up safety features that, are really limiting the fullness of the revealed truth of what something is expressing itself.
Yeah.
So,
and there's also that issue we touched on before about graven image kind of thing, where they're seeing the teacher as the perfect person in some way, and there can be this natural desire to have an object of devotion.
Yes.
But then they start to become devoted to the form and the person.
Yes.
And that creates issues for the teacher.
Yes.
But also, if the teacher has issues, and if the teacher has issues themselves, it brings those out too. I know some teachers who refuse to call themselves teachers, simply to avoid those kind of dynamics to some degree. And yet they certainly don't discourage natural expressions of devotion, but just the sort of the neediness and the dependency and the sort of trying to fill some gap kind of a thing, and externally oriented. as the teacher as a separate
Right.
individual. Yeah. I mean, I
Yeah.
still have, even with some awake people, I get surprised sometimes because there's this attitude that I'm special in some way.
Mm-hmm.
And, whereas my own experience is that no, it's not me that's this is, I'm just, the more I'm not there, the more the better it is.
Yes. Beautiful. It's the
Yeah.
absence of the
Yeah, of the me
limited
that's,
sense of self that
yeah.
reflects as the fullness of divinity.
Yeah, it's confusing what's awake and what's where the potency is.
Yes.
It's not in the person.
So in this, the authentic possibility and the more revealed truth of what the teacher-student relationship has the potential to be, is one where the self is clearly reflecting back to itself, yeah, and reflecting back its own pure divinity, in alignment with the recognition of purification as an inseparable aspect of any kind of comprehensive unfoldment, yeah, and resolution, so that the truth and the authenticity of devotion actually has a chance to flower. And that can be a very, very powerful thing. So all I'm saying is that it's not really in alignment to throw the baby out with the bathwater.
Yes.
And to miss the mark, to miss the point of what the truth of something is. It's always, when it is aligned with reality, it's always going to serve the recognition of reality within itself and the recognition that the teacher is not an other, but that doesn't take away from the value of what the reflection represents. For example, you and I both are aware of subtle support from certain lineages,
Yes.
and great sages and teachers, which
Yeah.
are not seen to be others, but there still is a value of sweet relation there. Yeah. And that relation is very sacred, and
Yes.
it's very precious, and it's very integrous. Yeah. There's an understanding in the Bhakti traditions called taking shelter that I find to be quite beautiful and helpful when it's understood properly. And it's essentially to take shelter of a lineage, or to take shelter of a teacher, to take shelter of truth, to take shelter of divinity, is to place everything that we feel our experience is, everything that we feel, our life is, into that which has reflected back the truth of our potential more clearly. And in that, there's a taking shelter of that truth, which then enlivens the recognition that what it is that seemed to be taken shelter of is not another. Yeah, that it's actually the self that is taking shelter of itself. Yeah.
Yeah. It's sort of like the idea of you reach out and they reach back and
Yes.
grab your hand and support you through the process. And it doesn't require a lot, but there are key points in the journey where it can be very valuable. And
Yes.
I've had, different expressions of the divine show up at different points on my journey. And to, basically point things out, or to guide the direction of my attention or whatever. I've also had the experience, not common happily, but I've had the experience of them stepping in when I wandered into a less savory place and didn't know how to deal with it, and they stepped right in instantly, and so that that certainly helped my own trust in the process when I recognized that they had my back, so to speak. And
Yes, that's exactly what taking shelter is. So
yes,
when we're under that shelter, it's really the shelter of the divine, but it
yes,
flows in like a tier system, like a tier support system.
yeah,
Yeah. Yeah. So the power of divinity flows in and then supports itself in that way.
yes. And for me, the initial thing was to learn techniques to help in that kind of thing in the future. and how to deal with darkness, essentially. But
Yeah.
at a certain point, um, I discovered that just simply flowing love,
Yes.
it's like it dissolves anything in its path, and um, it's effulgent, and so essentially it brings light to darkness, and
Beautiful.
dissolves darkness too. So yeah,
Yes.
so it's like the universal solvent.
Yes, it is power. Yeah, pure power.
Yes.
Yeah. There's also another point that I wanted to make. It's interesting because I grew up in the South and uh, was around a lot of different, kind of church settings and very religious expressions, and always some valuable principles in there, and I definitely encountered some authentic cases of devotion and love, and I really am grateful for the appearance of that experience, passing through various uh, seeming difficulties, and always being kind of brought back into some kind of possible spiritual solution, because it was really what seemed to be the only possible solution for someone like Andrew. And I also had the experience of living at a Vaishnava ashram for about 7, 8 months after I had already uh, had the pure divinity shift. So it was post nothingness.
Oh,
And so I was in a very, very kind of impersonal space. And I moved into this ashram. It was a very personal ashram, Krishna devotees. And it was a profound experience because although there was already this immense devotion, and it had expressed, uh, in towards different forms, namely Jesus Christ, Krishna, and Lord Buddha, the introduction to this particular bhakti path, which was not an accident, and nor was it just an
yes.
introduction, but a revisiting, uh, sort of reflected back some different possibilities within the experiencing. And what I cognized and realized is that these points of conscious experiencing as a part of a broader lila that they're not even aware of are not actually on the path to awakening. They're not looking for shifts in identity. They're purely cultivating certain uh, they're purely cultivating devotion. Yeah. So it's actually a play within the divine mind, if you will. And these points of experiencing are cultivating these devotional mellows, yeah, devotional moods. And their intention is to go to a different planet, and they will go to that planet eventually, yeah, if they're sincere and they are aligned. But it's important to note that, because there is a certain group, soul group, that's what's going on, and that's what their motivation is, and that's what their intention is. They don't have any desire for liberation. They it's a The divine is playing with itself, if you will, in this loving of itself in a particular way. So we've kind of covered several different things and touched on these different
Interesting.
possibilities that seem to be contradictory. One seems to be, within the realm of non-duality, and the other appears to be more referential to point value identification and or egoic concealment. And what I've found is that it's not either or. There's an argument that's been going on for 500 years or longer than that around personalism and impersonalism in India, uh, and these kinds of things. And the teaching that comes through here is called non-dual devotion.
Yes.
And there's actually the possibility, which is what you've been describing essentially, yeah, of there being what appears to be a personal devotion, but it's an impersonal personality. So
It's like those two we talked earlier about. There's the Shiva and the Shakti, and there's the masculine and feminine. There's
yes,
the personal and the impersonal. But when
yes,
you get to the top, they come together into
they
one.
come together. Exactly. Beautiful. And so that's where there's a non-dualistic flow of devotion. And there's still the possibility of tasting these devotional mellows, which is very uncommon uh, anywhere on the planet right now, but it will become more common, and it is becoming more common. I'm seeing it. So, and there's different possibilities for that, many of which are post pure divinity shift, initial pure divinity shift. Yeah. And it has to do with a certain flavor of love, a certain flow of love. Yeah. Where devotion is kind of enlivening itself in a particular tasting of itself this way, tasting of itself this way. And it's the understanding of Leela, yeah, or divine play is profoundly important or helpful in this kind of understanding, because it doesn't have anything to do with anything other than that. It's for its own sake. It's tasting that for the sake of tasting it. So savoring the sweetness of a flavor of love, savoring the sweetness of a flavor of divine love. In these flows of love, the divine can relate to itself in different ways. And there's an understanding in the Indian subcontinent of bhavas and rasas, yeah, which relates to, I think it's Natya Shastra, which has to do with aesthetic rapture, aesthetic expression, Vedic expression of aesthetic arts. Yeah. So there's a whole science, and it's profound, the details, and all, mostly in Sanskrit with some translations in English, and some more sectarian, tradition specific, and some Pradaya specific things, and all of that, which is wonderful and beautiful. But it can also be realized where there's no sense of otherness at all, and there's and tasted post supreme nothingness, where there are these different flavors of divinity relating to itself. And oftentimes these show up as like loving as a father, divinity loving itself as a father, loving itself as a mother. You see, on this planetary system, we're in a unique situation because there seems to be a distinct representation of the male and the female. Yeah. And that's not present on all planetary systems. But here, its presence allows for a unique expression of devotion. Yeah. And it's all according to the context and the time period. So, some of the traditions in India tend to have more of a feminine flow of devotion or understanding of devotion that's pointed towards a form of the feminine. Yeah. And then some are, in alignment with Krishna bhakti or, devotion to Shiva. And some traditions include both, Shiva and Shakti, and they're looking at the union of that. So there's all these different possibilities. And it's important to note, I feel, because they're going to become more common, and I'm seeing them become more common, these different mellows of devotion are coming online, and these different ways of tasting devotional love, the love of divinity tasting itself through what appears to be a separationless relational presentation. So, and this means that divinity could kind of love itself like a brother, feel itself that it's like a brother or a dear friend, or love itself like a sister, yeah, or a dear friend, a confidant, yeah. There's the possibility of loving as a lover, which oftentimes has been only strictly, all point values are females, and you only, divinity is a male, you only love it as a lover that way. But actually that's not the case. That was a part of a concealed age. And there's also the possibility of divinity loving itself in a feminine form as a lover as well, which is known as Kantabhava or Madhurya. Yeah, it's a form of devotional sweetness. But none of this is referential to separation. Yeah. It's a play of separationless fluidity as a sweetness of divinity tasting itself and loving itself. So I could, that's a very rich subject, but I just wanted to
Yeah,
mention it in
beautiful.
case
Yeah,
anybody is tasting these
that's
kinds
an
of.
interesting way to frame it. Yeah, I hadn't framed it that way before. Um, yeah, that's it. But it's interesting. You touch on a point too about the object of devotion. We poked at that a little bit earlier, but it can take many, many forms. And it's
Yes.
just what we relate to. Ramana famously expresses devotion to a mountain.
Yes.
Um, and because there are objects that become so imbibed with presence
Hmm.
that they're like a teacher in themselves.
Yes.
Um, sometimes people will go to the place where a deceased spiritual teacher lived because the place became imbibed with their presence.
Yes.
That kind of thing. Um,
There's certain stones that have been enlivened, and lingams, different structures that have
yes,
represent uh, a certain energy field, yeah, a
yes,
certain resonance within the self.
yes. And then there's one's mate as an object of devotion.
Yes.
Um, and you mentioned different kinds of love, brotherly love and love of children and
Yes.
so on. Devotion to the guru, devotion to forms of God, the kind of
Yes.
standard ones. Yeah, there's quite a and so as I mentioned earlier, it's not something you can necessarily predict in advance.
No,
Where
and
your love,
it's not something that's set. It's fluid. I mean,
yeah,
you can. I've had periods where, every flower that I walk by, it was like, what are you going to do? I mean, you
yeah,
just, it's not a particular, and it's not set to anything. One, one possibility that I find to be particularly relevant for our current time period and collective is the the devotion to the feminine as expressed as woman from the male. Yeah. uh, and then of course that is also, reflected back and potentially reciprocated in a very authentic and integrous way. Yeah.
yeah,
So there's a lot of residue, around uh, the male female seeming division and the illusion of separation and all of the limitation that has seemed to have taken place in that context. And through our through the grace of divinity expressing itself as the recognition of our reality as this silent, vibrant field all around, and the resolution of the material that has been coloring our perception and clouding the cognition of what is timelessly here, then a deep level of healing can begin to take place, within the flow of human life, between the male and the female, and between the male and the male, and our ability to love each other without feeling like that's weird or something
yeah.
strange. Yeah. So this
That's
is devotional relationship, and I feel like for uh, humanity, this is something that is in the cards. If things continue to unfold in a certain way.
yes,
And it's a very sweet and pure possibility. So,
yes. I'm looking forward to that.
yes, me too. Already having the privilege of tasting it, so it's very nice.
Yes, yeah, yes. I've had tastes and such, but yeah, sustained relationships. It's still challenging to stay fully open and
Yeah,
especially we've been in this current period with the pandemic and so forth. There's been these waves moving through the collective of purification, issues of fear and grief and various
yeah,
things coming up in these waves and waves and waves. It's processing, and sometimes you naturally pull back a little bit from that, and
Yes.
you want to break.
Yes.
But then, then step back, and because you can help. And when the heart is open to some value, then you're able to contribute to that healing.
Yes. And that's what is reflecting as the flow of devotional relationship. It's not an either or situation. It's not that there isn't surfacing taking place, uh, or there isn't purification. It's that while there is surfacing, while there's purification, the the devotion becomes dominant, the heart becomes dominant. And so it's in the context of that. Yes, that's what we want. We want unresolved material to be reflected up to the surface. I mean, we may not feel like we do. Something doesn't want it, but I mean, the heart does want that because it knows that it's through that coming up, being seen, being held, being allowed, being opened into repetitiously, that the authenticity of what we're talking about here today really comes online.
Yeah, that's a good point. The mind might not want it, but the
That's
heart
right.
does. Yeah.
Well, especially when we have spiritual concepts about like what the realized state should look like, and
Yeah.
we should be enjoying our
Yeah, what
whatever.
emotions are good or
Yeah,
bad or whatever. Yeah.
yeah. So
Oh yeah, no,
all
I had
of
a lot
that.
of I had a lot of concepts about anger early on there. I remember it's like, oh no, and this is back in my meditation days,
Sure.
before I woke up, and it's like, oh no, somebody saying there was a book, I guess about the 80s or something like that, called The Angry Book, and basically, looking at the way we're repressing anger, and that, and a friend of mine suggested it, and I was like, oh no, I'm beyond that. But then I looked at the book, I realized, yeah, well, maybe not so much.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, that's a great gift, is to just to realize that everything that we sort of innocently and unconsciously had condemned as being unspiritual isn't going to just disappear because we, say, oh, that's not spiritual. Oh, that's, as a matter of fact, it actually keeps it here. That's one of the interesting things, is that it's actually through consciously allowing those things which we had deemed to be so, no, that couldn't have anything, that's, it's not a matter of it being spiritual or unspiritual. It's a matter of recognizing that there's nothing but spirit, and that whatever arises within the field of spiritual reality, which is our conscious awareness, yeah, takes on a certain energetic validity. And that validity, in order for it to be resolved, has to be attentively allowed without the resistance to it and without the rejection of it.
Yes.
Yeah. And that's why safety features and attempts to modify things on the surface and to be a certain way, or to be better, to be more whatever, actually end up backfiring, like, uh, rather than serving. Innocently, it's of our nature to try to find solutions to what we deem to be problems, but we oftentimes don't even look at what the root of the problem is
Right.
and
And it's
recognize
the
that
mind trying to find the solution and
that's
fix the
it.
problem to make it go away, where
That's
that's a non-acceptance. And it's actually a
yeah,
problem in a lot of relationships, that
yes,
the mind is in there trying to fix something in the relationship, and it's
yeah,
not actually present to the relationship itself, and
yeah,
to the feelings. So how can you share, feelings easily if the
yeah,
person you're sharing them with is trying to
right,
fix you,
yes,
but in response to your sharing?
yes,
So it's
exactly.
kind
And that's like, the mind could take the concept of devotional relationship and then say, oh, that's wonderful. Now we'll have a devotional relationship. But see, the devotional relationship is automatic and spontaneous just through the resolution of that which is obscuring its natural flow.
yes,
You don't do it, you don't have to bring it into being. And that's the thing with terms like compassion and love. They get brought into the spiritual marketplace, and the mind, the limited identification, takes them on as things that we're going to do. We're going to be more like this and be more like that, but it doesn't address what's actually obscuring the compassion that's already here. We can't do
yes,
compassion, we can't do love. They do us.
yes. Good way. Good way. Yes.
So It's a parent learning process, right? We're always learning, and that's another, gift of devotion, is the teachability, the willingness to constantly just receive
Yeah.
that.
Yeah, and it's a beautiful shift from that place where we're in the mind and trying to maintain our self concepts and so on like that, into this place where we're just allowing and whatever's arising, and life to be as it is.
Yes,
And it's such a difference.
it is.
And devotion is a beautiful way to shift that process from the head to the heart, and however you want to describe that.
Yeah. Wonderful. All right, we're gonna have to stop talking about devotion. All right. So we always give all glory to pure divinity.
All glory.